every single time a disaster strikes now, a brutal, record-shattering heat wave, a catastrophic and sudden flood, a monstrous, roof-ripping storm, the very same question seems to echo. All across the news, and all across our own quiet thoughts, was that climate change. And for a very long time, scientists had a rather frustrating answer to give. They would say, we simply cannot blame any single individual event on climate change. The weather, they would patiently explain, is not the same thing as the climate. And so the question would just hang there, unanswered, storm after storm, flood after flood, summer after scorching summer. But that, now, has genuinely changed, because over the last couple of decades, a remarkable and a genuinely new branch of science has quietly emerged, one that can now take a specific heat wave or a specific flood and actually calculate with real mathematical rigor exactly how large a role climate change played in causing it. And, astonishingly, it can very often do so within a matter of just days. Before we go any further, if this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, take just 1 second to subscribe. A lot of folks watch these all the way to the end and simply forget to, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Alright, let's begin. To really appreciate just how remarkable this is, you first have to understand why scientists used to insist, so firmly, that it simply could not be done. And the core of the problem is this: extreme weather has always existed. There were devastating heat waves, and terrible floods, and crippling droughts, long before human beings ever began to warm the planet at all. So when a fierce heat wave strikes today, you cannot simply point your finger at it and confidently declare, that one, right there, was caused by climate change, because, after all, heat waves happen entirely on their own anyway. It is really a little bit like asking whether one particular person's lung cancer was specifically caused by their lifetime of smoking. In that one, single, individual case, you very often cannot say for absolute certain, because, of course, some people who never smoked a day in their lives still get lung cancer too. But, and here is the absolutely crucial insight, you most certainly can say, with total confidence, that smoking dramatically increases the odds of getting lung cancer across a whole population. And, as it turns out, you can do very nearly the exact same kind of thing with climate change and our weather. Because the real breakthrough, in the end, was to simply stop asking the wrong question altogether. Instead of asking, did climate change cause this particular event, which is a question that often genuinely cannot be answered, scientists began instead to ask a far smarter and a far more answerable. 1. Did climate change make this event more likely to happen, or more intense when it did? And there is a genuinely beautiful and a very simple way to picture exactly what they mean by this. Imagine, for a moment, a pair of ordinary dice. Now, in a world with no climate change at all, those dice are perfectly fair, and rolling an extreme weather event is a bit like rolling a double six. It is rare, certainly, but it does still happen from time to time, all on its own. But now, climate change comes along, and it quietly loads those dice. It subtly weights them, so that those double sixes, those dangerous extreme events, start coming up far more often than they ever used to. Now, you still cannot ever point to any one single roll of double sixes and prove that that specific roll was caused by the loading of the dice. But you absolutely can measure, precisely, just how much more often those double sixes are now coming up, across many rolls. And that measurement, right there, that is the entire heart of the science of what is called extreme event attribution. And I'm genuinely curious as we go, when a big weather disaster hits the news, do you find yourself wondering whether it's climate change? Let me know down in the comments. I read them all, and honestly, they often decide what I dig into next. So, how exactly do the scientists actually go about doing this? Well, the method they use is genuinely ingenious, and, at its core, it really comes down to carefully comparing two entirely different worlds against each other. The first world is the real one, the world exactly as it actually is today, with all of the warming that we humans have already caused baked into it, around 1 1/3 degrees Celsius of warming, in total since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So the scientists take the specific event in question, let us say a record, breaking 3-day heat wave over some particular region, and then, using both the real weather observations, stretching back over more than a century, and highly detailed computer climate models, they carefully calculate one number, just how likely is an event exactly like this one, in today's real, warmed-up world. But then comes the truly clever part of the whole thing, because they then go on to build a second, entirely imaginary world, what they call a counterfactual world, and it is an Earth precisely like our own in every single respect, but one. In this imaginary world, human beings never emitted all of those billions of tons of greenhouse gases. It is, in effect, a version of our planet without any human-caused warming at all. And, using their climate models, they can actually simulate that imaginary world too. And then ask it the very same question all over again. Just how likely would this exact same heat wave have been in a world where we had never warmed the planet in the first place? And then, finally, they simply compare the two answers directly against one another. If it turns out that the event is, say, a full 100 times more likely to occur in the real, warmed world than it ever would have been in that imaginary, unwarmed one, then, right there, you finally have your answer. Climate change made that particular event 100 times more likely to happen. It is, in essence, a way of running the experiment that we could never otherwise run, of peering into the alternate history of a planet we chose not to have. And it is worth pausing for just a moment on why climate change loads those dice in the first place, because the underlying physics is actually beautifully simple. Take heat to start with. When you warm the entire planet, you are in effect shifting the whole bell curve of possible temperatures slightly to the right toward the hotter end. And even a small shift in that curve has a dramatic effect out at the very extremes. Temperatures that were once at the far, rare edge of what was possible suddenly become far more reachable, and brand new records, once unthinkable, start falling with alarming regularity. And then take rainfall and floods. Here, the physics is different. But just as clear, warmer air is simply able to hold more moisture, around 7% more, in fact, for every single degree Celsius of warming. So a warmer atmosphere becomes, quite literally, a bigger sponge, soaking up more water and then wringing it out in more sudden and more intense and more catastrophic downpours. This is precisely why a warming world does not just get hotter, but also, in many places, gets wetter and stormier, all at the very same time. And the results of actually doing this, over and over again, for many hundreds of individual events all around the world, have been genuinely and often startlingly striking. Let me give you the one single study that really started it all. Back in the summer of 2003, a truly horrific heat wave settled over Europe and went on to kill tens of thousands of people. And then, in 2004, scientists performed the very first study of this entire kind upon it, and they found that human-caused climate change had at least doubled the likelihood of a heat wave that's severe ever occurring. It was hailed, at the time, as a genuine scientific breakthrough, the first time in history that anyone had ever successfully detected the distinct fingerprint of human activity on a single, specific, individual weather event. Quick one before we continue. If someone in your family or a friend is the kind of person who argues about this stuff, please do send it their way. That word of mouth is honestly how a channel like this one grows. And if it's been worth your time so far, a quick like really does help the next person find it too. And this science has only grown sharper and faster and more powerful in the years since. Consider, for example, the absolutely ferocious heat dome that cooked the Pacific Northwest of North America back in the summer of 2021, an event that shattered all-time temperature records across the region by as much as 5 whole degrees at once. Well, just 11 days after it happened, while the disaster was, remarkably, still fresh in the news, a rapid attribution study delivered its stunning verdict. Climate change, it found, had made that heat wave at least 150 times more likely to occur, and around 2 full degrees more intense than it otherwise would have been. In fact, that particular event was so far off the charts, so utterly extreme, that the scientists ultimately concluded it would have been very nearly impossible in a world without global warming. And that speed, just 11 days, is itself a genuine revolution, and it is no accident. Because a dedicated team of scientists, working together as a group called World Weather Attribution, deliberately built a faster way of doing all this, precisely so that the answers could arrive while the disaster is still unfolding in the headlines. And that timing matters enormously, because the immediate aftermath of a catastrophe, those raw few days when a shocked public is actually paying close attention and asking hard questions, is the one brief window in which the science has the very best chance of actually being heard and of genuinely shaping the conversation about what comes next. A study that arrives 2 years later, buried in a journal, changes very few minds. One that arrives 11 days later, while the wreckage is still smoking, just might. And this, it turns out, is a genuine and a recurring pattern. Because when researchers went and systematically analyzed many hundreds of separate heat waves from across recent decades, they found that climate change had made the typical one many, many times more likely to happen, and that a genuinely startling fraction of them, something on the order of a quarter of all of them, would have been essentially impossible without human-caused warming. And it is worth being very clear about what that actually means. These were events that simply could not have happened at all, not ever, in a stable climate that we had not first altered ourselves. But here, now, is the single thing that I personally find the most genuinely impressive about this entire science, and it is the very thing that truly separates it from mere advocacy, or wishful thinking. Because it does not, in fact, always come back with the answer yes, this was climate change. Sometimes, quite often actually, it comes back and it says plainly, no. When scientists went and carefully mapped out every single attribution study that had ever been done, they found that around 3/4 of all the extreme events analyzed had indeed been made worse by climate change. But that figure also means something important in the other direction. It means that roughly a full quarter of them had not been. That for those particular events, the science looked, and honestly found that climate change had played little or no significant role at all, and that they had been driven, instead, mostly by the ordinary natural variability of the weather. There have been very real cases, certain major droughts, for instance, where the researchers fully expected, going in, to find a clear climate fingerprint, ran the entire rigorous analysis, and then honestly reported back that they simply could not find one. One well-known example came when scientists studied a devastating drought and famine in Madagascar, which had been widely described in the press as the world's first climate change famine. When the attribution team ran the numbers, they found something genuinely surprising. Climate change had not, in fact, played a significant role in that particular drought at all. The suffering was terribly real, but its main drivers turned out to be natural variability, along with poverty and other local factors, not global warming. And the scientists said so, plainly, even though it complicated a compelling and widely repeated story. And that, right there, is exactly what makes this genuine, rigorous science, rather than some foregone and predetermined conclusion. It is a real test, one that genuinely can, and sometimes really does, come back negative. It is also very much worth understanding that this science is far more confident about some kinds of events than it is about others. Heat waves are, in a certain sense, the relatively easy case, because the fundamental link between a warming planet and more extreme heat is so direct and so physically straightforward that attribution studies focused on heat tend to be highly robust and highly confident in their conclusions. But other kinds of events are a great deal trickier to pin down. Rainfall and flooding, for instance, are far more variable and chaotic in their nature, and much harder to accurately capture in a computer model, and so attributing them tends to carry considerably more uncertainty along with it. And things like droughts and wildfires are more complicated still, because they depend on so many different tangled factors all interacting at once. And good, honest attribution scientists are always very careful and very upfront about every bit of this, which is exactly why every single proper study comes attached with an explicit, stated range of uncertainty and a clear, honest declaration of just how confident they truly are. So why, in the end, does any of this genuinely matter beyond simply satisfying our own natural curiosity? Well, it matters for a few genuinely important reasons. First, it fundamentally and permanently changes the entire nature of the conversation, because for years and years, the whole public debate was hopelessly stuck on the vague, an abstract and easily dodged question of whether climate change was even real or truly happening at all. But attribution science drags that whole conversation down out of the clouds and into the concrete and the local and the immediate. It stops being about, is the climate perhaps changing, someday, somewhere far away, and it becomes, instead, climate change made the specific. Deadly flood that hit your own town. Last week, 40% more likely to happen. And that is a very much harder thing for anyone to simply wave away and ignore. Second, and this is where it starts to get genuinely consequential, attribution is now increasingly being used inside actual courtrooms. Because this science was, in fact, partly born in the first place out of a desire to help establish legal responsibility for climate harms. And today, as ordinary people and even whole governments who have been harmed by climate disasters begin to bring lawsuits against the largest fossil fuel companies in the world, these attribution studies, including remarkable new work that can now trace specific individual heat waves back to the emissions of specific individual companies, are quietly becoming powerful pieces of legal evidence. And third, it genuinely helps us to prepare for what is coming, because by revealing in hard numbers exactly how much more likely and how much more intense these events have now become, attribution science can tell our cities and our engineers and our governments precisely how much they truly need to adapt, how high exactly to build the new flood walls, how to redesign an overloaded power grid, and how to plan sensibly for a future that will no longer look anything like the past. So let me end, as I always try to, with genuine honesty and with real balance. First, it is genuinely and critically important to be precise about what this science actually does and does not ever claim, because it never, ever says that climate change simply caused a specific event outright. That would be a real overstatement of the case. What it says, instead, is that climate change changed the odds, that it made a given event more likely, or made it more intense. It is, fundamentally, a science of probability, and not one of simple, direct cause and effect. Second, as we have already discussed at some length, it does come attached with real, and honestly stated, uncertainties. The final results depend heavily on the quality of the underlying climate models, and on precisely how you choose to define the event in the first place, and very much on which specific type of weather you happen to be looking at, with heat being far, far more certain than either rainfall or drought. And the rapid studies, the ones done in just a matter of days, are naturally and unavoidably somewhat less thoroughly vetted than the slower, fully peer-reviewed ones that tend to follow along later. And third, we really must always remember that natural variability has certainly not simply gone away. Climate change is never the entire story of any single event. It is, rather, a thumb pressed firmly on the scale, usually taking an already bad situation and making it meaningfully worse, rather than conjuring entire disasters up out of absolutely nothing. A heat wave, after all, was still very much a heat wave, long before we ever warmed the world. The entire point of attribution is not to claim that climate change somehow invented extreme weather, but rather that it is now measurably, and very often, quite dramatically, stacking the deck against us. But the far bigger picture that all of this finally reveals is genuinely and deeply profound, because for the very first time in all of human history, we can now hold up a single individual disaster, one specific heat wave, one specific flood, and actually read, written right there into the very heart of it, the clear and measurable fingerprint of what we, as a species, have done to our own planet. That old, comfortable, familiar dodge, the one that always went, well, you simply can't ever blame any one single storm on climate change, is quite simply no longer true. Because we now increasingly can do precisely and exactly that. And what this remarkable science keeps telling us, event after event after event, is that the strange and violent and record-breaking weather that now seems to fill our news more and more with every passing year is not, in fact, merely bad luck, and it is not just our imaginations running away with us. A very great deal of it is entirely real, and it is genuinely measurable, and it carries, unmistakably, our very own fingerprints all over it. So the very next time that a truly historic heat wave settles down over a city, or a so-called thousand-year flood rises up and swallows a town whole, and you find yourself quietly wondering, was that one climate change? I want you to know that this is simply no longer an unanswerable question, nor is it any longer a mere matter of opinion or of belief. Because somewhere out there, right at this very moment, a team of scientists is very likely already hard at work running the numbers, carefully comparing our real warmed world against the cooler one that we might otherwise have had, and getting ready to tell us, with actual, hard evidence, and with an honest and open measure of their own confidence, just exactly how much of that particular disaster we ourselves have made. The weather, of course, has always been wild, and always will be. But for the very first time in the whole long story of our species, we have finally learned how to ask it one very direct and very simple question. How much of this one is us? And at long, long last, to actually hear a real and honest answer come back.